Good morning and welcome to this Sunday school lesson. We're in a new month and a new study, and I have to apologize for being several days late. COVID put me down for a few days, and right now I'm got a cough drop in my mouth, and I'm hoping that I can get through this lesson without blasting your eardrums with a lot of coughing. But it's the first one in our study of First and Second Kings. There's a lot of background information, and it sets the tone for the upcoming lesson. So I thought it was important to cover it, or it is for me to have that continuity when I'm studying, and maybe it would be helpful to you too. Now, you might remember when we studied last winter from Ezekiel and his writings to his fellow captives while they were held in Babylon. At that time, the temple and Jerusalem were in ruins, and the southern Judean tribes were scattered about in Babylon. The northern tribes had previously been taken into captivity by the Assyrians. Well, today we're starting First and Second Kings, which is what we would call it a prequel. In other words, it happened before what we're going to be studying this for the next few months, 3 months is exactly, is what happened before the Israel was taken into captivity. And we get a lot of the history of God's people, and we'll see exactly what caused them to get into a fix so that they were taken into captivity. But First Kings begins with the end of King David's reign, and it's the beginning of Solomon's reign, which was dated about 971 BC. King David had reigned for about 40 years. He was God's chosen king to follow Saul. He was anointed very unexpectedly by Samuel when he was young, maybe about 15 years old. He was a great king, but not without flaws. He had an adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. He was responsible for her husband's death, and the consequence of those sins was the death of the firstborn son of David and Bathsheba. Now, they later had another son, Solomon, of course, whose reign begins our study in the book of First Kings. David had several wives, and he had a whole lot of discord and conflict among his children. He was getting older now and approaching death, and his fourth son, which was the oldest one alive at that time, Adonijah, and I think that's the way you pronounce it, felt that he would become the next king. Well, Bathsheba learned about his efforts, and she went to David for confirmation that Solomon would be the next king. Well, David didn't know anything about Adonijah's plans either. So he called in all of his key officials, and he commanded them to organize a coronation at once to establish Solomon as the next king. Excuse me. And then he gave some dying instructions to his son. And he told him that he should follow the Lord all of his days and remain obedient to God's covenant. Now, Solomon was a powerful king. He was wiser than any man of his day. He was the author of 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs. And all of that background information now, and it's in a nutshell for sure. It brings us to our first scriptures for today, which is 1 Kings chapter 3. And I suggest that you go back and read chapter 1 and 2 so that you get all of the background information in full detail. But we're going to begin in chapter 3 with verses 4 and 5. And the king, and this is Solomon, the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there. For that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give thee." Gibeon was about 5 miles from Jerusalem. So you may wonder why Solomon would travel away from Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. He was going there to begin his reign in a worship service to God. Near Gibeon, though, was a hill with an elevation of 2,400 feet. So it really was physically a high place. That area around there had been the location of a Canaanite city at one time. And the high place where he was also the spot where they had conducted their pagan worship. Now, King David had moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, but he was not allowed to construct the temple. The tabernacle and a bronze altar that Moses had constructed during the wilderness journey were located at Gibeon. So at that time, Gibeon was the central place of Hebrew worship. Solomon, as you see, was not stingy with his sacrifice. He offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that bronze altar to begin his reign with a time of worship to God. And then God appeared to Solomon in a dream while he was at Gibeon and asked him what we might call $1 million question, which was, what shall I give you? And Solomon's answer to that question would surely reveal his heart. His response to the question is revealed in our next scriptures, which will be verses 6 through 9. Excuse me. And Solomon said, Thou hast showed unto thy servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth, and in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. And now, O Lord, my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this, thy so great a people? Solomon understood the connection between God's great blessings and faithfulness to him because he had witnessed it in his own father's life and legacy. His gaining of the throne was evidence of God's continued fulfillment of his promises. In 2 Samuel, God had said to David, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. That was from Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 and 13. Now, David was not a perfect man. He succumbed to temptation, but he had a consistent relationship with God, and his heart pursued God without fail. And Solomon, by recounting all that God in David and his father, the relationship that they had, was not in any way trying to rule on his father's coattail. You know, sometimes we might ask a person if they're a Christian, they say, "Oh, I've been raised by a Christian mother and father." Well, he was recounting David's blessings from God, but he was not trying to reign on the relationship that God had with David. He thoroughly understood his own inadequacy for the job he faced. He referred to himself as a servant and a youth. It's believed he was in his early 20s when he took the throne, but his inexperience in leading a nation made him feel like a child. He knew he was placed in that position because God put him there, and he was addressing his total dependence on God for guidance as such. And after affirming God's goodness and grace, Solomon was ready to answer in total sincerity the question of what God could give to him. He asked for a heart that would hear and obey so that he could determine the good and the evil to correctly judge God's people. In 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 10, his answer was worded a little bit differently. it was recorded as, "Now grant me wisdom and knowledge so that I may lead these people. For who can judge this great people of yours?" Judge meaning to govern, rule, and execute judgment. Solomon had been given a God-sized task, and the success in fulfilling that task would not come from his own ability. It would only be through God's strength and guidance that he would be successful. He needed God's help, and he humbly and unashamedly asked for it. Now, even today, God sometimes puts opportunities and challenges before us, and they may seem to be too great for what our minds can comprehend or what we think is humanly possible for us to do. But we have to remember, as with Moses and Noah and Solomon and others from the Bible, the disciples that Jesus called to follow him, God does not necessarily call the people who are equipped, but he will equip the ones that he calls. God is always pleased when our requests line up with his will. And he was really pleased with Solomon's response, as we'll see in verses 10 through 14. And the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, "Because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked for riches for thyself, nor asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. Behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was more like thee, none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if thou wilt walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as our father David did walk, then I will lengthen thy days." God was pleased with Solomon's request, and he was pleased with what he did not ask for. He did not ask for a long life. A king's reign is only as long as a stronger rival chose not to overthrow him. And when that occurred, the conquering king would take the life of the overthrown king and his family to eradicate any heirs to the throne. He could have asked for wealth, either for himself or for resources to bless others, but he didn't ask for wealth either. And it was a common practice when a new king did come into power, they would put to death any potential rival or enemy to the throne. And Solomon did not ask for the lives of his enemies. His request was completely selfless, and God was pleased so much with his response that he wanted wisdom and an understanding heart. God gave him more than common understanding. He gave him an unsurpassed amount of knowledge and wisdom. He said, "No, would be no king before you or after you that would surpass your wisdom." Now, if we don't ask of God, then we won't receive. And in James chapter 1, verse 5 says, "Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him." The wisdom of God described in James is pure, peace-loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, and without pretense. That's exactly the kind of wisdom that God gave to Solomon. And he gave it in unimaginable abundance. God also promised he was going to give Solomon some things he didn't ask for. He was going to give him more riches and honor than any other king had ever had. He would surpass all the kings of the world in riches and wisdom. And then God gave another promise. Solomon didn't ask for, and it came with a provision. If he walked in obedience as David had done, his life would be long. Many good blessings came into Solomon's life: wisdom, understanding, wealth, honor, and length of days. His reign became known as Israel's golden age, and it was marked by peace and prosperity. God has a lavish generosity for those who walk in faith with him. And now there's one more scripture for today, which is verse 15. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings, and made a feast to all his servants. Remember, the ark of the covenant was in Jerusalem. The altar, the bronze altar, and the tabernacle was at Gibeon. So he went back to Jerusalem. So Solomon woke from the dream, but he was fully aware that God had spoken to him. His request aligned with God's purposes to serve his people and to begin his reign by worshiping God. And this time, he offered sacrifices before the Ark of the Covenant. In giving the burnt offering, Solomon was dedicating himself to God the same way that he did at Gibeon. And this time, he also gave a peace offering, which was always done in response to unexpected blessings. Now, God gave him promises, but the promises that were made by God were as if they had already taken place. And finally, he took the time to celebrate the work God had begun in his life by hosting a feast for all his servants. All Solomon asked for was so he could serve God's people better. Now, this is a little side note. It really has nothing to do with this lesson directly, but indirectly it does. It won't be long now before some nominating committee member may be asking for your acceptance of a position in the church next year. Keep in mind how Solomon's prayer request was to better serve God's people, and to let that guide your response when they come and ask of you. God provides for his purpose to be done if we just ask for it. Every successful organization, whether it's a church or a business, must have a vision in order to progress. Successful individuals also need a vision, or a goal, we'll sometimes call it. Success and progress aren't found when we, as a group or as individuals, just stumble around without a plan of accomplishment. And we've seen how these messages from the Bible, written hundreds of years ago, are still full of truth and relevancy for today. And there's a song that goes along with this lesson that demonstrates relevance through the years and the need for a vision in life and what our vision in life should be. And when we have this vision, everything else falls into place. And by relevancy through the years, I'm saying that because this hymn was an Irish hymn written in the 8th century. Now, that was just a few years back. A century is 100 years, and we're now in the 21st century. So there's a math question that you can ponder a little bit. I hope you got the time to stay online and hear the message in this song. The wording of it is not exactly in our modern day conversation type of speaking, but the message is powerful. And if not, then I hope you can join in again next time. And maybe next time the Sunday school lesson will be on time. We'll hope so anyway. Okay. Come on. Take that little square.
thy true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joy, so bright, heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art.
Have a good week. Join in next time.